Hey everybody, hope y'all are doing good. Things haven't really been great for your boys Skittles lately, but they're starting to look up, so we're gonna make it. I wanted to talk a little bit about the Project Storm ITG pack, just got released recently, and I'm really excited to start seeing the competitors dig into it, hoping to make for some really exciting matches at this year's Storm. I had a thought or three recently about ITG tournament packs through the ages and how pack design has evolved through the years of the game, and it occurred to me that I'd never really seen anything like a how-to document or a guide for building tournament packs. And from what I could tell, a lot of the TOs of old haven't really left anything in writing on the subject. I thought it might be interesting for some folks, maybe even a little beneficial, to take a bit of time to walk through some of the design questions and thought processes I went through when I was putting this one together. Hoping it'll be interesting to people who want an example of what to think through when putting together a competitive ITG pack, and to provide a bit of a teaser, for so to speak, of what I'm hoping to accomplish, not just with this year's pack, but also future Storm packs. To start off, when building any tournament pack, it's a good practice to take some time and really define exactly what the goals for the pack are. Now, that might sound a little silly in a way, but it's always a good idea to have something down in writing, a codifying idea or set of ideas that really set out the purpose of what you're trying to do. Having that solidified up front is really important later on down the line when you're trying to sort out all the possible song selections and you're not really sure if one thing or another is going to be a better pick for your event. Now, they don't really need to be very complex or esoteric by any means, and I honestly wouldn't advise putting more than 2 or maybe 3 down, because the more you have, the more you're going to risk accomplishing one goal at the expense of another. So for this year, I had 3 main goals. I wanted to build a tournament pack that facilitates meaningful, exciting, and fun head-to-head matches for Project Storm competitors and spectators of all skill levels, allows players to confidently compete at the highest level of practice and preparation during the event without conflicting with the ongoing ITL Online 2025 event, and lastly, sets the starting point for future Storm packs by establishing a foundation of mostly newer charts with some lasting competitive viability to better facilitate my vision for future pack design. The first 2 are identical to the goals that I had for last year's Storm, and the third is kind of the solidification of what I've been wanting to do with the Storm packs in coming years, so long as it's practical to do so. I'm going to touch on that one a little later on. For now, I'll start right at the top. Goal number 1. Creating meaningful, exciting, and fun matches. So over my years involved with ITG as a player, a content creator, and a TO, one desire I've heard from a lot of players, particularly upper-end competitors, is to put on matches that are just as exciting to watch as they are for them to play. For some folks, competing with their friends and determining who's the best is just as important as putting on a good show for friends and spectators. With that in mind, I want to select sim files that aren't only just a robust test of technical or timing prowess, but files that are simply exciting and fun to play. Now, I'll be the first to admit that that is a bit of a subjective target, but over several years of playing and competing and curating for ITG, I've developed a little bit of a sense for charts that are exciting for a general majority of competitive players. At a very high level, this tends to lean towards charts that are both physically and technically harder to execute, but there's a number of invisible, hard to quantify traits that promote some charts over others. It's more than just being a well-designed test of a given technical element. It has to be something that people genuinely enjoy practicing and ultimately feel good showing off a little bit on. Music choice plays a pretty significant factor in that, but variety in a chart also plays a part. Too little variety in a chart, and the challenge becomes kind of one-dimensional and maybe even a little boring. Too much variety, which is a bit of a moving target, can make the experience feel kinda incohesive, random, and not really fun to try and execute in a head-to-head match. Now, frankly speaking, most music that gets charted for ITG these days is gonna kinda naturally have that feeling of cohesion and theming just due to the composition of the song, so that's not something you really have to worry too much about, but it's something to keep in mind. Generally speaking, if the song makes you pop off and the chart flows well, it's a good contender, at least to start off. So fun and exciting are reasonably easy to explain, but what makes a match meaningful? To me, facilitating a meaningful match is about creating a pack that generates the highest chance for every player to walk up to the pads thinking, oh yeah, I've got this. I know I can knock this out. I'm going to win this. So for a match to be meaningful, to me, the majority of the songs that appear in the card draw in any given match need to be something that the competitors are going to feel confident playing in a head-to-head match. Unlike most competitive head-to-head games, there's very minimal interaction and engagement with one's opponent during the match in a traditional dance game tournament. For example, consider a fighting game. A head-to-head match in a game like Street Fighter VI or Fatal Fury is essentially just a constant dialogue between you and your opponent, as you each challenge the other by using your selected character's skills, abilities, special moves, and so on. Every movement, every testing jab, every whiffed attack is a shared interaction between the two players that is ultimately going to lead towards the match's outcome. In dance games, once you get on the pad, it's just you and the chart. Other than being next to your opponent, you don't really have any sort of shared interactions that are going to determine the outcome of that match. The only chance that you really have to interact and engage with your opponent is before the match even begins, during the card draw process. At the highest competitive level, the card draw is about a little bit more than just deciding what gets played or not. It's a pretty substantial amount of strategizing and mind gaming around the picking and vetoing process, where each player theoretically needs to take into account how well they know the available charts, what each chart does, and whether they feel particularly skilled at executing it better than their opponent, and estimating what charts in the draw are going to result in a favorable match outcome for themselves based on their knowledge of what their opponent is good at. With that in mind, it's important to build a pack that maximizes the chances that for any random 5 or 7 or 10 cards drawn from the pack, there's enough of a well-balanced spread of content types to promote as many skill sets and player biases as possible, while also maximizing the amount of agency each player has during the card draw process based on their practice and chart knowledge. In the event the charts in the draw are overwhelmingly skewed towards one skill set or another, there's a risk of creating an unfair advantage or disadvantage for any given player, which is going to decrease the agency they have in shaping the match's outcome during the card draw, and theoretically it could end the match before it even begins. This, to me, is what meaningful means. Creating a pack that allows every single one of those very few interactions that you have with an opponent to be a viable opportunity to shape the match outcome in your favor. Of course, card draw is always going to have an element of randomness to it, and sometimes you just have some bad luck. In addition to that, creating the opportunity for success here isn't only about the pack design. The burden of practicing the songs in a tournament pack and preparing for the event is ultimately going to lie with the competitor. In my opinion, though, the TO or the pack designer is going to share some of that burden because they're responsible for constructing a tournament pack that has a fair balance of content types. This is going to help ease the preparation effort for each competitor and reinforces their agency during the card draw process, which ultimately allows each competitor to approach their matches with the highest confidence possible. That confidence is an excellent segue into Goal 2. So for those unaware, the typical end date of the yearly ITL Online event tends to run right up against Project Storm's date. It's no surprise that many of the players that commonly enter and compete in Project Storm also avidly participate in ITL Online. Rather than asking competitors to split their time between participating in ITL Online 2025 and preparing for Project Storm, I've opted to allow for both by primarily using content from ITL 2025 to fill out this year's pack. Of course, there are some downsides to this, which I'm going to touch on in a second, but this is a fairly simple way for competitors to kill two birds with one stone, as it were. It's also beneficial to me in terms of time management. Since I'm on the curation team for ITL Online, I've already done a lot of the review work to scope out charts in that event that are also a good fit for head-to-head competition. When I'm going through that process, I'm typically evaluating charts on their fit for both ITL and Storm. It's easy to take this fact for granted, but a lot of times charts that are really great for long-form grind events just aren't super viable for head-to-head performance, and vice versa. So usually, when I'm going through the ITL submissions, I'm also making notes and tentatively slotting things in for future Storm facts if I feel particularly strongly or confidently about them. If something I'm keen on ends up getting approved and used in ITL, it just elevates its usefulness for me because I know people are already going to be grinding it and practicing it. I want to minimize the chance of someone feeling unprepared for Storm, if it's at all possible, because the more prepared and confident someone is about the charts in their pack, the more agency they're going to have during that card draw process, which, as I discussed, is going to make it much more likely that every song in a match is going to feel meaningful to them in some way, rather than any of them feeling like a total wash just because they're not familiar with what they're being tested on. Lastly, goal 3, building a foundation to work off of for future Project Storm packs. Obviously, this one is a little bit more focused on my own goals and my visions for ITG at Project Storm. It's significantly important to how I've approached the previous 2 goals, but also a bit subjective and personal. When I was first given the opportunity to design the Project Storm pack, and really even before that, I had been doing some research and questioning around what TOs in the past had done to build their packs and what the competitor base thought about their results, mostly by digging around an ancient forum post and asking a handful of longtime competitors who are still around today that had actually attended these events what they thought about them. One thing that a lot of these sources mentioned to me, among many, frankly, was that in the past, tournament packs tended to be more consistent from iteration to iteration, or even from one tournament series to another. This kind of helped promote this sense of legacy to each one of the charts, and allowed the charts to become kind of more memorable and beloved. In addition, it also promoted a good sense of excitement when players just gradually got more and more skilled at the charts in question and started putting on better and better matches each time they came up. To quote one longtime competitor, typically charts and tournament packs didn't get cycled out at all unless another chart was made that did what the original one did, but in a cleaner or more interesting way, or if the competitors just finally got sick and tired of playing a chart. Surprisingly enough, that often took a few years to happen. One example I was given was a chart that was in 3 or even 4 years in a row of tournament packs, and nobody really had an issue with it up until the very end. So that mentality ties really well back into my goals of allowing competitors to approach each event and each match with the highest level of confidence and agency. However, that's only one part of the story. The ITG scene of today is quite different from the ITG scene of yesteryear. Today, not only do we have online events like ITL Online, Stamina RPG, and the remote ECS events, and so on, that feature many, many charts, we also have a much larger base of skilled content creators that pretty regularly provide the community with a really high number of very quality sim files. Along with this, the mindset that a lot of longtime competitors have had around content use isn't as ubiquitous anymore. Some players these days of all skill levels appreciate or even prefer a more frequent content cycle. Given my position as pack designer for what I feel is one of the premier ITG tech tournaments, as well as my own history as a content creator who understands what it feels like to see one's work getting featured in new events, both remote and in person, I want to find a way to balance the old school mentality of letting charts be long running and multiple tournament packs while still trying to find ways to utilize new content for the sakes of both the player base and the creator base. On top of all that, and on a more personal note, I really want to celebrate the long history that custom ITG content has by finding ways to use the occasional legacy revival as a way to show newer players some of the foundational content that built what tech is today, as well as having a little fun and sparking some joy in older players by giving them a chance to run it back on content that they may not have tried in a while. Plainly speaking, it's not easy to do all that. But with all that in mind, I actually started the process to capture this vision last year, during Storm 2024. There were a lot of charts in that pack that had been in use for a decent little while in various events, both head-to-head and remote, and while they're all very high quality and still fun to play now, I needed to do something to start with a clean slate. So I approached the Project Storm 2024 pack with the idea of giving a lot of these charts a bit of a last hurrah for head-to-head play before I kind of set them to the side to rest for a little bit. For Storm 2025, I've used as much new content from ITL 2025 to build a new foundation of high-quality competitive charts, most of which I believe are going to have some staying power for the next couple of years. By the numbers, I replaced 2/3 of last year's pack with fresh content, most of which debuted, metaphorically speaking, in ITL 2025. Moving forward, I'm hoping to replace significantly fewer charts each year over the next year or two, and build some continuity between each Storm pack, using ITL content that people already know due to grinding in that event to kind of bridge the gap there. Ideally, I'd like to get the replacement rate for each year down to somewhere between 30 and 40% of the pack if it's practical to do so. While I plan to primarily utilize content that gets used in ITL due to some of the reasons I gave earlier, I also really want to relax that personal restriction a little bit and begin bringing in some new high quality content that isn't in ITL or may have competitively debuted in other tournament packs, as well as bringing back the occasional revival chart from older events, when it's practical to do so, of course. Really, the main thing is that I don't want to give people the impression that charts have to be used in ITL for them to be even considered for Storm, because ideally, that shouldn't be a requirement at all. It just made the most sense for me over the past year or so, given what I've been hoping to do in the future, to do it this way now. Of course, there are no actions without consequence, and while I know what I'd like to do with the Storm Pack, there are many risks I'm taking with this process that I think it's pretty fair to address. The biggest one's a two-parter. One, using charts for more events in a row is going to increase the chance that the player base just kind of gets tired of playing them, especially given the mentality differences between now and ITG in the past. And two, it could build the perception that high-quality, competitively viable charts are getting overlooked or even dismissed in favor of building a rigid continuity. This one's a challenge, given the logistics, so to speak. Assuming nothing changes for the foreseeable future, there's going to be 400 charts in ITL every year, and likely hundreds and hundreds more than that get created and released otherwise. Project Storm happens once a year, and assuming the pack side doesn't need to change for whatever reason, it's only going to have about 120 charts each year that have to build a reasonable difficulty curve from the bottom of low division to the top of upper division. The numbers just aren't in my favor, really. So, in acknowledging that, I think it's important that I stress that what I'm doing is not something that I believe should be seen as a requirement for any other event pack in the slightest. My primary objective for Storm is to create an event that the competitors who attend now and have attended in the past are going to enjoy to the fullest. And based on the information I have available and the feedback I've received before, I believe this is the best way I can do it. Other TOs running other events also have that same burden, to create the best event possible for their attendees and competitors. But every event and every attendee demographic is going to be different in a lot of different ways. I would encourage other TOs to not look at the pack that I build and the guidelines that I'm following as a requirement to run a good event, but rather only as an example of some things to consider when building a pack and how to approach pack design based on the logistics and the details of the event that you are trying to run. At the end of the day, I believe that for a TO to build a good event, the best and most important source of feedback on that is the competitors who are attending. So I encourage all pack designers to keep that line of communication open and healthy, even if it's just through face-to-face conversations during and after the tournament itself. I plan on doing this myself, and if after this year and next year I hear that people think it stinks, I'm gonna pivot. I gotta do whatever I can do to ensure that Storm remains one of the best events that attendees can come to. With all that said, let's take a look at the pack itself. Now, I don't intend on going over every single entry line by line. I just want to cover some of the general ideas I was going for with each division, as well as the reasoning behind some of my picks based on feedback I got last year. For lower division selections, I wanted to first and foremost focus on making the pack look approachable and fun for players who aren't necessarily completely immersed in the modern ITG tech scene or are crossovers who main other dance or rhythm games but wanted to take a shot at a competitive ITG event. Song selection is a really big part of this. I want the choices to be fun and catchy songs that just make people want to step up and compete, even if they don't feel 100% confident in their abilities. So, to that end, I looked at a lot of no tech and low tech charts to pop music or cute and otherwise catchy songs. Things like You Make Me Wanna Purr, Kissing Game, and Not My Fault fit this in my mind, as well as some longtime classics like Blackout and Move That Body. There's also a few stamina oriented charts like Junk Mania in there, and for the most part, you don't really have to be good at modern ITG tech to play these confidently. You just gotta have a good grasp of the fundamentals of dance gaming. On the other hand, though, this is ultimately an ITG tech event, and even in the lower division, it's important to emphasize that tech execution and timing skill are the primary focuses. As such, I included some charts that utilize technical elements of modern ITG in ways that are fairly simple and approachable for people who are dedicated to the game, but not necessarily easy to intuit and sight read without some practice. Good examples of that are Moretsu Fire, 300 million yen, Honey Classic Mix, and When I Fall. My hope is that these charts have just the right amount of tech to separate casual rhythm game players from ITG tech mains without being too confusing or physically demanding for a lower division player to excel on. Moving on to middle division, now this portion of the pack was actually the most difficult for me to build and shape to a point I was satisfied with. To me, this section of the pack needs to be the most well-rounded, all-encompassing sampler pack of modern ITG tech scene possible, while still not being unreasonably difficult for players that have advanced from lower division, but also not being too easy for competitors who are starting to break into upper division content. So the need for catchy and enjoyable songs still applies here, but by this point, it's pretty safe to assume that the competitors are going to be well aware of what modern ITG tech is, and they're going to need to be given a pretty robust and balanced challenge. Charts that are gently multi-tech, such as All I Need VIP, Gorge Tech, Volcanic, Big Beat, and Sector, alongside some highly focused skill checks like Crossfire, Punchbox, and Lo-Fi M, and some well-established crowd pleasers like Slamurai and Voxel are all a great fit here, and in my opinion, they capture a great little snapshot of what the average modern ITG tech player enjoys and can be reasonably expected to get tested on in a head-to-head environment. Similar to lower division, though, some less technical charts that are still physically challenging, like Tricolor Circus, Hexer, and Bitter Juicy, are going to allow multi-game competitors with strong fundamentals to still feel like they have some agency and a competitive edge in those middle division matches. Now, for upper division, it's no holds barred. This is where the content can really get challenging both physically and technically without fear of being a bad fit for the player base in question. Things like Dodo Red Version, Juggler's Madness, Logic X1.wave, and Chariot all serve as challenging examples of standard multi-tech charts in the modern area. And selections like Summersick, All Hail, and Synergy are good examples of top-end skill checks for unique and difficult examples of modern tech. However, it's very, very easy to get carried away with these types of charts and make the pack just too hard on average. One lesson that I pulled from some of my research into packs of old was that even packs built for the best of the best still need some slightly easier filler charts in there. These charts showing up in the draw add a little bit of an extra element of strategy to the pick and veto process. They allow competitors who are deep into an all-day pools run the chance to breathe, so to speak, while also asking the question, sure, this chart might be pretty quadable normally, but can you quad it right now, on command, in a head-to-head match, with a tighter FA plus consistency than your opponent? You got one shot. Charts like Bad Boy and Mr. Werewolf are probably the closest things that are to serving that function here, while still being pretty difficult. A similar mentality also helps inform the decisions for some of the hardest songs in the pack. When charts like Laserbeam, Clinozoicite, and Xena appear in the draw, the question becomes one of endurance, one of the hidden challenges of a head-to-head tournament. The players in upper division are all capable of putting out some pretty gnarly runs on these charts, but again, they have to ask themselves, am I fresh enough right now to put down a competitive run on this near the end of a long day on a setup that I'm not as familiar with? Or am I just going to get smoked? So to cap off the pack overview, I want to take a moment to address some items of feedback I got last year following Storm 2024. For the most part, competitors I spoke to seemed pretty satisfied with the pack as a whole, but naturally there's always some room for improvement. There were two big issues that I wanted to remedy this year. One of them was a lack of charts that focused on movement-heavy tech, especially towards the upper end of the pack. Frankly speaking, this was just a bad oversight on my part, and this year I tried to address it by adding charts like Pro's Eye, Bitter Juicy, Punchbox, Immediate Results, and High Tech Stay Alive, along with moving Burning Flame up to the shared middle and upper division block. The other issue, one that was a bit more difficult to address, was how hard the pack was last year. The pools matches in upper division were brutal beyond belief, with charts like Tech Alert getting played as early as the first few matches of pools by competitors who had no more than one or two songs to warm up and prepare. While on some level there's always going to be a chance that the card draw is just unfriendly, that was really unpleasant for a lot of the folks involved. So the challenging part of this, though, was that on Sunday, during the double elimination bracket, those same song choices were substantially better received due to the 2-hour warm-up window that the competitors were given prior to matches beginning. Having that dedicated time to get loosened up and ready for the hardest charts in the pack made them significantly more approachable, even by the end of the bracket. This is another good example of one of those hidden challenges of a head-to-head event, playing the high-end content in short notice with usually pretty minimal warm-up. While the format of Storm allows for some warm-up time prior to that double elimination bracket, accounting for pools matches, which have less warm-up time in general and are played in a gauntlet-style format, is a pretty interesting challenge to approach from a pack construction standpoint. I spent a huge amount of time experimenting with different pack formats, song choices, division splits, and so on, trying to find a way to account for this, and unfortunately, the only way I could find that resulted in a balanced pack for each part of the event was to just split it into pools and double elimination. I don't like doing this from a logistical standpoint because it can be a little confusing for players who aren't really familiar with ITG tech events, and frankly, it just looks messy on the song wheel to me. But it was the easiest brute force way to solve the issue. It's not all negative, though, because having them totally separate gave me a little more leeway for making the bracket matches more exciting. Packs between upper division pools and double elimination are largely identical to one another, so there's not too much extra burden on players reaching the bracket where needing to practice a completely new set of songs, but some of the simpler and physically easier charts and pools have been removed just because they're not really going to be exciting and totally meaningful in what could be a grand finals scenario. These charts got replaced with some very difficult challenges that are probably too hard for pools play, but a great fit for the final matches of the tournament, as well as charts that are just not fun to play without a good warm-up prior. Things like Alert, Atopy, and Modular Technology, as well as 3 very brutal 15s that, in my mind, all jointly capture all of the skills that are required of the best competitors to win. Next year, I hope to refine things a little bit more and make the difficulty curve up to the double elimination bracket be smoother and hopefully remove the need for that pack split. So if anybody has any thoughts or ideas on how to approach that, I'm all ears. I think that about covers everything I want to say here. I could definitely yap for hours about this kind of stuff, but I'll wrap things up now. I hope you've enjoyed listening, and I hope that by laying my thoughts out like this, folks in the community and other TOs can start to understand a bit more about some of the decision-making processes behind tournaments and pack design that, in my perception, haven't really been discussed that often in the past. To conclude, I want to again emphasize that I do not intend for this to be seen as me saying, "Oh, you must follow this process and these guidelines to build a tournament pack, otherwise it'll be bad." That's not the case. Rather, I just want to give folks some insight into the kind of things that one might consider when they're building a pack or creating an event that your attendees are going to enjoy to the fullest. Thanks for watching.